Welcome to Journeys of Belonging to Blackness.
I am Black. I've always considered myself to be Black. My mother is Black. My dad is Black. As far back as I can remember, my great-grandfather and mother and my grandparents thought of themselves as Black people and called themselves whatever the popular phrase or label was for Black at the time that they lived. My aunts and cousins think of themselves as Black too. Well, for myself and for members of my family, we all move through the world as Black people. And yes, I think that because there's a family history of various mixtures on both sides, the sum of those mixtures is what members of my family and myself carry every day. Often, but it's not always clearly visible in our physical appearance or what we know of our geographic ancestry, DNA. But our Blackness is also in the culture and the rituals I practice. Especially among those of us who live in countries like the United States or in Europe, our identities as Black people are also shaped by the perception of what others think about us and what they also think what Blackness is and what Blackness isn't.
The concept of Blackness is cognitively slippery, meaning that once you think you have a hold on what you think it is, it transforms into something else. In part, this is due to the variations in defining Blackness and how it's been represented and expressed differently over time. The understandings of who is Black in one place at one time does not necessarily follow the same logic that applies elsewhere at other times. There are historical trends of words used to define what is Blackness or to define an individual as Black that vary across countries and cultures and even in language. Ultimately, slavery as a historical reality for African descendants established a racialized notion of Blackness. Colonizers' descriptions of African descendants as Negro and later as Black meant that Blackness becomes generally associated with Africa and that every African and African descendant person is seen as Black regardless of their actual skin pigmentation, tribal and cultural affiliation, language, religion, and geopolitical location.
You may have a person self-identify as colored, but not Black. Or you may have someone else who identifies as Black, but not African American. And perhaps there are even some people who accept all of these labels, while there are some that only choose to embrace Africa as an identity.
To be Black, to me, it means to be a person who originated from the continent of Africa. I don't think of necessarily Africans in Africa as in the context of Black. I think of them more as Africans, but in the context of Western society, I think of it as a darker skinned person who originated from the continent. But on the continent of Africa, Black is not enough of a distinction. There's so many shades, so many cultures, so many things that make up African people. I think Black on that continent does not do justice.
I have always identified as Hispanic, but the older I got and the more I asked questions about our family and things that no one ever told me, I started questioning whether I was just Hispanic. I knew that my mom was part Italian because I knew about my grandfather's history, but that's the only part that everybody ever talked about. They were so proud to be Italian. And so I was like, but Grandma spoke like Creole and she like had a French name. And even though she was white, she didn't look 100% white. So can you explain that to me? She had family in Haiti. Like no one ever wanted to talk about it. So I started asking questions. And then I just in my mind, I was like, you know what? I think that we are more than what I've been told. And so I started identifying as black and white because I figured black plus white equals brown. And it makes more sense to me than saying I am white and Hispanic, because that doesn't feel right. It never felt right to me. I hate checking boxes. It never felt right to me to just check Hispanic and white, which is what a lot of people who are Latino or Hispanic end up checking. But I started identifying as black and white and Hispanic probably, I don't know, like 10 years ago, which may have been confusing to people, but it made sense to me. And that's how I felt.
Blackness, like Black American, there's been a differentiation between Black American, people who are West Indian or Jamaican or African. So all my life, I would be accused of being in one of those other categories of Blackness. People making jokes saying, you like to work too much, you work too hard. Are you sure you're not Jamaican? Are you sure you're not West Indian? Men who were married to African women would say, they would ask me if I was from Africa, what part of Africa. People from different places saying that I looked like one of their people. One person, I don't remember when this happened, saying that I didn't look like your average Black American woman. I don't know what that means. And I said it to another friend, and she said, well, you don't. She's like, I do, but you don't. And I was like, I don't know what that means.
I didn't know myself to be Black, having grown up in Ghana. In Ghana, there weren't any different races. But definitely I came to be aware of my Blackness because I live in the United States, or when I started living in the United States. And, there were these words like people of color. And I remember thinking, I was like, what color? Like, why are you using color? Like, what does that even mean? Like, it sounded so weird to me. For those who are Black in this country, who've been raised Black in this country, born and raised, most of them descendants of slaves, there's an awareness of a struggle. There's an awareness of a difficulty that the race has experienced having lived here in the United States. And that awareness is not, like, I did not come to this country with that awareness. And honestly, for the first 10 years, first 8 years, I would say I didn't want to be encumbered with that struggle, because I felt like that mentality would somehow make me feel inferior and therefore become inferior. Since, graduating from college and becoming more and more aware of how things play out and the history, how Black people have existed in this country, I realized that I do have to reckon with the fact that I'm a Black person. In Ghana, for instance, we celebrated our independence in 1957. And it's funny because Kwame Nkrumah was like, it's now time for the Black man to rule his own affairs. That's a rallying cry for, like, not just Black people on the continent, but for Black people in America too. It's essentially the same struggle, just that in Ghana, it's more of like a global sort of countrywide. The Europeans still want to be our colonizers. They still want us to be financially dependent on them, et cetera, et cetera. The struggle for Black people is kind of the same. It's just that, like, on the continent, it's a little different. Here, it's like in your face. It's in the community. It's microaggressions that you're experiencing. It's things that people are saying directly to you. Like, go back to your home. I never imagined that was what was happening. We are all kind of the same people, and we have to figure out how to move forward together.
Quayshawn Spencer. I'm the Robert S. Blank Presidential Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. The nature of the race debate in philosophy of race, at least with respect to the U.S. context, has been to ask what is the thing that counts as race, and who are the races, and is race real? If it's real, how is it real? But in my research, I've found that focusing on a part of philosophy called semantics, the philosophy of language, understanding meaning, things like, what does it mean to be Black? It's like, it's to have genomic ancestry from the African population, right? And genomic ancestry is different from ancestry. That's how you can solve the problem of having origins. Having origins is different from having genomic origins. Genomic ancestry is this concept of you have your genome. Your genome is subdivided into these smaller units called alleles. And those alleles have origins, right? They come from specific geographic regions in the world that were previously isolated for long periods of time. And if you have, say, 80% of your alleles coming from Africa, then you're 80% Black, right? In this government's race talk. And so that's one way of thinking about Blackness. It's a way that is surprisingly starting to intertwine with people's racial identities, which I think racial identity is a separate way of thinking about race. It's not the same way of thinking about race in an ancestry and genomic ancestry based way. But yet some people are using that to develop their racial identities, right? And so you can have Blackness understood as racial identity being informed by genomic ancestry and then changing your racial identity in response to it. Think about races in certain contexts. These are other contexts beyond the ancestry talk that we use. Say, when a police officer is pulling you over, right? They don't care about your ancestry. They're not asking for your 23andMe report, right? They're looking at you and they're seeing, what you look like and then classifying you and going from that to an inference about how to treat you. They're racializing you. Those are racialized groups and being observed or perceived to be phenotypically similar in a certain way that's tied to some geographic ancestry. So now you're in this context of the police is pulling you over. You could be Fijian American, you can be African American, doesn't matter. You look Black, you're perceived as having, Afro, they have afros, black hair, brown eyes, wide noses, full lips, right? So now, then they go through the inference, the other part of a racialized group definition is that then you're subordinated or privileged in certain ways relative to that marking. And so now, you're treated in a certain way, right? There's certain risk that you've taken on having the gall to drive while looking the way you look, right? That's another way to think about Blackness. In my pluralism, those are both equally legitimate ways. This is how we talk. So sometimes we talk about ancestry and sometimes we talk about appearance and social structure.
Speaking with each of my participants, I realized too that we all grapple with the semantics of the term Blackness. The multiplicity of its embodiment is reflective in our daily experiences. And even in speaking with Dr. Quayshawn Spencer about the ways the racialization of our perceived and observed and often assumed geographic ancestry by others as both individuals and then as part of a larger global community, how it determines the conditions in which we're able to live our lives fully, without interruption, how it determines how we're treated, how we are judged, celebrated, and even denigrated. Blackness is diverse. Blackness is not a monolith. And on this journey of belonging to Blackness, I am with so many other folks of African descent who are eager to move beyond the confines of African enslavement and colonialism as if it's the singular defining aspect of Blackness. Now more than ever, stories about the experience of African descendants must be told and must be listened to.